Hello, and welcome to Season 5 of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected. I'm your host, Folasade Ologundudu, and on the show, I'll share the interesting and inspiring stories of artists, critical thinkers, thought leaders, and art professionals on a wide range of topics about life, work, society, success and failure, and the ways in which we navigate life. We talk about our inspirations, concerns, and the ideas that motivate and propel us to create. Much of the show centers on visual arts and its pervasiveness in our society, how culture shapes our lives, and the responsibility of artists and curators not only to be truth tellers, but to advocate for and care for the massive impact that culture plays in our lives, from the things we believe in to the ways in which we understand ourselves. As I travel to art fairs, gallery openings, and events within the creative industries, both in the U.S. and abroad, join me in discovering and learning about some of today's most interesting and dynamic artists and creative professionals. If you're new to the show, I'm glad to have you here. If you've been on this journey with me for a while, welcome back. Let's get it. On this episode, I'm joined by Michelle Kuo, Chief Curator at Large and Publisher at MoMA, as we discuss Jack Whitten, The Messenger, the first comprehensive retrospective dedicated to the groundbreaking art of Jack Whitten, born in Alabama in 1939. The exhibition showcased more than 175 works, including paintings, sculptures, rarely shown works on paper, and archival materials, to explore the depth and breadth of Whitten's near 6-decade career. The show was critically acclaimed and emotionally impactful. On this episode, Kuo describes the collaborative and intensive 5-year process that involved curating the exhibition, highlighting Whitten's innovative approaches to art. On the episode, Michelle Kuo speaks about Jack Whitten's positioning alongside such instrumental figures, mechanical figures as Rothko, Picasso, and Mondrian, and more importantly, the ways in which Whitten reconfigured art history to include experimental practices that broke ground within the abstract expressionist movement with the use of new tools and techniques. Whitten's practice is marked by a courageous and uncompromising vision to resist the pressures of conformity and instead carve out his own path through abstraction. This episode emphasizes Whitten's visionary nature and the lasting legacy of his art, which continues to inspire and move audiences today. Let's dive into my next episode with Michelle Kuo. Michelle Kuo, thank you so much for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you today to learn more about the show, Jack Whitten, The Messenger.
Thank you.
So I'll jump in with the first question. What has been one of the most surprising things that you've experienced thus far with the show? It closed just this past weekend.
Yes.
So we know it's not on view anymore.
Absolutely. The last day was just yesterday, so it was a very emotional day. And I would say that's part of what's been so surprising about the response to the show, which has been beyond my wildest dreams. Often we work on these projects and we put them out there in the world and you just don't know exactly what to expect. But the response has been incredible, and in part because I think Whitten was such a virtuosic inventor. He was such a polymath. He created so many interesting connections to technology and to form and to matter. But the overarching response to the show has also been one of emotion. Like, people are genuinely moved every single day almost. I encounter someone who says, "Oh, I was moved to tears," or "I saw this person in the gallery and they were crying." And I think his story and the large-scale issues that he confronts in his art, even though his work is primarily abstract, somehow resonates, and in particular through even the sheer matter or plasticity of the acrylic paint that he uses. And I've never really seen anything like it.
He was truly a pioneer There was not another artist like Jack. He was in a realm all of his own. I want to talk a little bit about how long the show had been in progress or in plan, even just in your mind with you and your co-conspirators, because there were other curators as well who I'm sure were part of this process. But how long was the show in the works? And as you reflect on your individual goals, your dreams, and perhaps your personal aspirations around the show, as a curator, as a writer, and a thought leader in the field, do you feel that you've achieved whatever it is that you set out to do initially?
Yeah, so I first met Jack Whitten in person actually around 2010. I was drawn to his work. I saw some of it in New York Gallery, but to be honest, I really didn't know much about him. I hadn't heard much about his work, even though by that time he had been working for decades, since the 60s, just to give you an idea. And I was drawn to the work because of its relationship to technology. Whitten had done an artist residency at the Xerox Corporation in 1974, which in and of itself is a really strange thing. It's not every day that artists were working with engineers or going to visit these corporate R&D headquarters. But in any case, to make a long story short, I saw some of that work and was totally entranced. And that was even before I then found out about all of his incredible engagement with abstract painting more generally, with the histories of race, politics, and world change. So in 2010, I met him. I ended up interviewing him and writing about him and his work. At the time, I was the editor of Art Forum magazine. And so I published a big feature about his work, and I ended up putting one of his paintings on the cover. And that was in 2012, at the beginning of 2012. And that was a really important milestone in my life. Actually, if you had asked me in my years at Art Forum what was the issue that I was most proud of, I would have said the Jack Whitten issue even before I started working on this exhibition. The exhibition itself has been about 5 years in the making, but we've been working on other things too at the same time. So it was really the last 2 years, I would say, we got very intense and just really trying to accelerate all of our efforts for the show. There's been a great team. I was working with a team of curatorial assistants and research assistants, and it was very much all hands on deck. I traveled a lot to see a lot of Whitten's works in different institutions and private collections, and at the same time thinking about that exhibition as a ultimately posthumous occasion. He passed away in 2018, was just an extraordinary, I think, testament to how Whitten all along believed that his work belonged in the same halls that you would see Rothko and Picasso and Mondrian and these kinds of leading artists of the 20th century. So to do that at MoMA was very singular, because when you walked into the show and when I stepped back and finally looked at all of the paintings and drawings and sculptures in those galleries at MoMA, it felt like those works had always belonged there, like they looked completely at home. And yet at the same time, that work, his work, also, to my mind, transforms and totally upends the history of abstract art as we know it. So it was turning that out from within. And that was something that I felt will always stick with me and is probably a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Yeah, you said a lot of things that I want to touch on, but one is really the idea that exhibitions are things that take time. The time for research, the time for conversation, the time for co-collaborating with co-conspirators, with an entire team of people, learning about someone through the eyes and the ears and the testimony of other people that have been close to them. And I'd love to hear you share a little bit more about that, about the deep work that goes into exhibition making and curating, a term that people use so arbitrarily these days.
Yeah, there were a couple of things to your point. The wife of Jack Whitten, Mary Whitten, who herself was a paper conservator. They married in 1968. They met at Cooper Union. Mel Edwards, the artist, was their best man. Mary Whitten is incredible. And their daughter, Mersini Whitten, together with Mary, had for years been working on the estate, essentially, and the studio and all the archives. So his studio in Queens is still intact. It's as he left it, basically. There's still bottles of wine that he was drinking that are on the table there. All his tools, his kind of mad scientist inventory of paints and strange chemicals and things that he was mixing together, and a number of works as well, some of which, of course, literally have just been at MoMA and will get returned now that the show is over. So the family was extraordinary, and that's also a pretty special thing. Sometimes it can be really complicated, but I would say that Mary and Marcini Whitten were just extraordinary partners in this whole endeavor. They had worked along with a team that they have to organize. Whitten made thousands of drawings, for example, that are many of which have never been seen before. We included a lot of them in the exhibition, but that's still the tip of the iceberg. He wrote copiously, as I think he wrote almost every day in what he called his studio log. Sometimes it was like, I had this for dinner, or now we're going to Greece. He spent every summer in Greece. Sometimes it was a really meticulous accounting of, okay, I made this work today, or these past few months, it took me 1,500 hours. I just put on the last tesserae. So it's really incredible the amount of material that's there, and the family has been just key to helping us make sense of it. And that was the years going to the archives, which are essentially just in this studio in Queens, but as well seeing works and reading his writings elsewhere. That just was a real labor of love, and it takes time for sure. And then I think the other thing that's interesting about Whitten's work is that he worked a lot in series. In fact, sometimes maddeningly in series, and all his titles sometimes are really confusing because they'll say something like Liquid Space, so number 1, Series A, lowercase Roman numeral 5. And so it's very interesting because he worked in series, and you often see him working out along the way in that series all of these ideas and thoughts and experiments, and he didn't know where he was necessarily going to end up. So to get a handle on all of those experiments and all of those series and all of those ranges, and then for the purposes of a museum exhibition, you have to pick from that. You can't show the entire series. You can't show all the series, and you certainly can't show every single thing that he ever made. So to choose, but to see enough where you could feel that you could make a choice based on certain directions that you wanted to go, that took a lot of time. But that was, of course, also the really fun part.
Yeah. You're making me think the show has since sunset, as you mentioned, no longer on view, but the catalog is still accessible. People can still purchase that. So to anyone listening in, if you're interested, please purchase the catalog if you didn't have a chance to see the show. Shameless plug there from Michelle and the whole MoMA team. Because it's really important. That's how exhibitions continue to live on, right? Yes. One of the things I'm thinking of, again, so many questions, so many things come up in your responses. You earned your BA at Stanford University, majoring in art history and political science. Why then does that make an artist like Jack even more interesting?
Wow, that's a great question. And thanks for looking that up, the deep cuts. But yeah, from the beginning, I think I was maybe not even aware of it, but I was interested in this question that afflicts all art historians, which is, how can you look at something, like how can you look at a ball of clay or a sort of slab of acrylic paint, and how can you from that try and think about what it means and the historical context in which it was produced? But not only that, what might it signify in the future, and how might the artist have connected the dots between all of those things? And again, that's something that there's no right answer to, but I think because just even early in my studies, I was looking at, on the one hand, this question of how can an artwork, which is such a weird object, it's not like other artifacts we have, it's not like a legal document, it's not like a spoon that someone left and we're trying to figure out how people use that spoon. It's a very strange thing. It's got endless meanings to it, yet it has a shape, it has a form, it has some structure that the artist gave to it, or a collective of artists or a group of people gave to it. So why is that significant? And then in political science, by the same token, rightly or wrongly, that's a whole discipline around trying to say all of this catastrophe, crises, but also activity and essentially jockeying for power has happened over human history. How do we try and make sense of that? Are there patterns? Are there structures, are there systems that can help us explain, to understand, and even maybe predict what's going to happen? And that's clearly a social science. It's not a perfect prediction. In the same way, art history is never going to be some sort of eureka, we've unlocked the answer and that's it, as much as people might try. And so for me, that's one way into a work or a practice like Jack Whitten's, who really, more so than any artist I really know, somehow brought together all of those queries. He himself was thinking about, what are the systems that shape us? What are the legacies, for example, of a system like slavery, and how has that shaped the world that we know now? And at the same time, he, for example, there's a great quote of his, which is that memory is trapped in the material. And you look at some of his surfaces and they look like mud or red clay, evoking a bit the landscape around which he grew up in Bessemer, Alabama. He also has works that have metallic elements in them. They're big slabs of acrylic paint, but they've been infused with all these different kinds of minerals or other materials. And another favorite story of mine about Jack Whitten is just that he said his first visual memories, his first aesthetic memories, were actually of the hot rolled steel in the steel mills around Bessemer, Alabama, and the iron ore quarries and the coal mines. And there's a kind of heartbreaking reason for that, which is that he, as a child growing up in Bessemer, Alabama, because of racial segregation, could not visit the art museums. He was not allowed. So instead, they took the school children to the steel mills, the coal mines, the iron ore quarries. And I just love the way that he transformed that terrible experience into something that was about how form and how material itself can somehow embody or trap within it these memories and these histories.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating account. And thank you for veering off the path and leading us there, because I think one of the things that's coming up for me is the idea of Black interiority, Black imagination, the idea that one has to imagine something that doesn't exist to push past reality, to push past what is. And this endless imagination that you can see all throughout Jack Whitten's career and the bodies of work that he produced. I'm also thinking about the fact that he chose to be a teacher and chose to be a professor for much of his life, much of his professional life. And what does that mean to be in an environment where there's the birthing and the coaxing out of new things and impressing young minds, but also being impressed by them, that there's this exchange that's happening all throughout the process of creation? And that there's not really a question I want to go to, but I just really appreciate that you brought in some of Jack Whitten's personal story and some of his history. And now I'm thinking a little bit about something that Toni Morrison has said, and she's been quoted as having said things like this over many periods of her lifetime. But the idea that the enduring that people experience, the survival that people experience, pushing through something that's difficult to come out of it with new ideas, with a different perspective, that there's a lot of beauty and texture in that. And if we succumb to just what is without imagining what could be, it's almost like as human beings, we're not reaching our full potential. And I think in an artist like Jack Whitten, you see someone who really wanted to push past what he could do to do even more.
Absolutely. And I would say that for someone like Whitten, that constant experimentation, that inventiveness is A, truly extraordinary, but B, it's about a lot more than just creating different styles or processes, which he did do and which is extraordinary. Through that experimentation, I think, to your point, was able to very fluidly create new ways of being in the world and in fact even almost speculating about the future. He was obsessed with the future, with science and technology, but in a way that I think also, as Toni Morrison has said, is almost one of the first almost postmodern ways of looking at the world. Unfortunately, it was born of the total dehumanization of certain groups of people. And Whitten, I think, living through that, was able to think about, okay, if, as he said, I come from a people whose culture has been totally cut off, he said, quote, "The prize is to reconstruct the culture, but not just to reconstruct, but to create something new." So for Whitten, there is this idea that experimentation is actually almost like a means of survival.
We've said a few times that the exhibition is closed, but I think this is a question that I feel is quite relevant. What do you hope, or what did you hope people take away from the exhibition and leave with that they didn't have before? Is there any particular impact that you hope it has on them?
Yes, I think it is a body of work that you actually have to see in person. And as much as, so Whitten was really singular for actually thinking about photography very early in his career, and somehow thinking that he's making paintings out of acrylic paint, but they're almost alchemical, and he thinks of them as almost photographic processes. He calls the tool that he uses to make the paintings, to make a long story short, the developer, as if he's developing an image, but he's using this tool to make a painting. Later with Xerox, same thing. He's actually experimenting with the pigment that's in a photocopier machine. And nowadays I have to ask people if they are familiar with a photocopier machine. But in any case, this pigment that is used for a Xerox is electrostatically charged. It's actually ionized. So what does Whitten do in the 70s? He takes that cartridge. He doesn't just use the Xerox machine to make some stuff. He takes that powder, that pigment out of the machine and starts to sprinkle it on canvases, on pieces of paper, combine it with other chemicals, and then use a heat lamp or even magnets to manipulate this powder, which is totally strange and fascinating. So I think for the show, I really hope that people, it's something that they have to see in person. After all of that and all of his relationship to photography, his works are completely impossible to photograph. The colors are really singular. They're really strange. The textures, the materiality of it is really strange. He's basically using, by the end of the last half of his career, acrylic paint to sculpt with. And so I hope that people were able to see that in person and really that it might change their ideas about what art is or even could be. And that actually also, to your point with in the catalog and his own writings, I think even after the show, they can read his writings. They can actually look at his lesson plans. We've included those in the catalog as well, and a lot of other archival materials. And they can think about how he almost gave us tools for the future. He often was writing, another colleague of mine that worked with me on the show said it was almost like what he was writing over almost 60 years was like he was writing for a future audience, like for us. Absolutely. And you really get that when you read his journal entries. And when you look at his work, the other thing that comes to mind is just this almost tools for the future where he knew that in his own time, and maybe even now, his work was shape-shifting. It's very hard for people to know what to make of it over a career. It doesn't really cohere into one necessarily harmonious whole. A lot of his work is really strange. It can look almost the poured acrylic paint surfaces that become sculptural. He would set them in molds that he cast from just the surfaces around him on the street or bubble wrap. So they almost look like detritus. On the other hand, later in life, when he developed this technique of setting sheets or even slabs of acrylic paint, letting it dry, and then slicing them into small mosaic tiles that were often almost stone-like or ceramic-like, those can look almost decorative or ancient. And again, people don't exactly know what to do with that. And my hope is just that people were able to come see this work in person and maybe have it change what they thought was possible with art in the first place.
Love that. Brilliant. We're going to round out a little bit, but I want to talk about the scale and the scope of the show. With more than 175 paintings, sculptures, and works on paper, as well as objects and ephemera, how did you make those decisions? How did you decide what are we keeping and this one has to go?
Yeah, it's a great question. For example, there's one entire big gallery in the exhibition, which was really sizable, an entire gallery devoted to just 1 year of his practice from 1973 to 74. And that's because I saw it as such a turning point. We really were honing in on this almost magical moment of invention when he's just really experimenting. And that's a deep dive. And then later we may actually go through ranges of years and decades even in one gallery. So honestly, for us, it goes back to that question of how do you connect an artist who was inventive and constantly experimenting and not do what could be the path of least resistance, which is to make just a straight line, to say like he did this and then that led to this and that led to this, because that's just not how history works, right? And in particular for Whitten, I think more so than almost any other artist, he was truly open-ended. He didn't know exactly where he was going. We wanted to pick examples from this huge corpus of work that would really be like turning points in his experimentation and allow us to offer moments where he's fully experimenting and improvising. He's inspired by jazz improvisation and specifically the work of musicians like John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, et cetera, that start with the structure but find freedom within that form. And that was the way we were trying to choose works. I always say there could easily be sequels, many sequels to come where you highlight different aspects of the practice. But by showing the full arc of his career, 60 years, we were able to say, okay, here's somehow how he could take his inventiveness in one form and then carry that over into another.
Yeah. Final question. You've been so generous in your responses, so just thank you for that, Michelle, the dialogue and the exchange we've been having. I think after summing up everything that we've talked about so far, I think one of the things that's coming up for me is thinking about the mapping of the show and the arc of his career, but doing it within a way that presents this universal quality of how prolific and creative people can be as artists. You spoke about his early life, his life in Alabama, going to segregated schools. It wasn't until Jack Whitten came to New York City that he was in an integrated classroom for the first time in his life, which to read that into today's world is really mind-boggling. I had to pause and read it again to just think about what could that have birthed for a person, right? And to then have the experience of now being in an integrated classroom, how that even in and of itself could change the way one sees the world, obviously have deep impacts. But I think the idea of materiality, memory, the idea of continuing to find new ways to reinterpret things that you're already seeing, to find influences, the improvisation of jazz coming out in his improvisation and new techniques that he's birthing. That to me, all of that speaks to something universal, even if it's through the lens of a Black abstract expressionist artist from America, with all the labels that has and all of the supposed boxes and confinements that might impose on a person within thinking of the way the world is organized, the way history is told. But Jack seemed to live a life and be an artist that broke through all of that. It's like his 60-year practice was all about breaking through those boundaries.
Yes, definitely. And a really important aspect of him thinking about abstract art in the first place is that in the 60s and 70s, he was under great pressure from a lot of his peers who, for example, in the Black arts movement, were very directly focused on representational art and illustrative art or stories of uplift. And so for Whitten to say, no, I'm going to make these, again, strange abstract pictures is really just renegade in that way. And then later on as well, actually, through the rest of his career, 80s, 90s, et cetera, the kinds of abstract painting and then the very singular form of acrylic mosaic that Whitten developed, artists were saying painting is dead for the fifth time. They're moving on to what we now call conceptual art or performance or photography. And it's just interesting to me because to my mind, Whitten actually infuses so many of those questions that, let's say, quote unquote, conceptual art was exploring, but in his work. And it was just, he was still so endlessly fascinated by this very fluid, shape-shifting, essentially synthetic material that is acrylic paint. And that stuck with him for the rest of his life. But he was always breaking those boundaries and he was always doing things that people were saying, oh, you shouldn't do that. So that's pretty incredible. And I think just to have that force of conviction when you have no audience, no market, just takes so much drive and ingenuity.
He was definitely a courageous man. One
Yes.
could say that for sure.
Yes, definitely.
Michelle Kuo, this has been such a wonderful episode. Thank you so much for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be here.
That was my episode with Michelle Kuo. I want to give a big thank you and a big shout out to Michelle for joining me on the show.
And it's a wrap, folks. That was our episode of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected. Conversations on culture and current events with some of today's hottest creative contemporaries. These episodes are recorded remotely and on location wherever in the world that I find myself, whether that be Africa, the US, Europe, the Middle East, or the Caribbean. Depending on where I am at the time of these recordings, you will hear the sights and the sounds of my local environment. I look forward to continuing these wonderful conversations with you, with artists and creative professionals across a variety of industries. I'm your host, Folasade Ologundudu, and we'll see you next time. As always, stay motivated, stay inspired, and stay up. Peace and love, y'all. We out.